State television cuts to a stone-faced spokesman reading a single line that will move oil markets by morning. No direct talks with the United States. Not now, maybe not for weeks. 6,000 miles away, off the coast of Oman, a line of oil tankers sits anchored and going nowhere. Some have been idling for days. Nobody on either side will say for certain when they move again. This is the moment. Sunday, August 9th, 2026. And what happens in the next 72 hours could decide whether the Strait of Hormuz reopens or whether the world's most dangerous oil choke point stays a war zone. Signal number one, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi just torched Washington's timeline in public. He said Tehran won't sit down with the Americans directly until the U.S. makes amends for what he calls repeated violations of a ceasefire memorandum signed back in June. His words, relayed through state media, were blunt. As long as the violations continue, there is no possibility of resuming negotiations. Here's what nobody is telling you. Just 5 days earlier, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on CNBC and said a deal could be reached today or tomorrow. President Trump backed him up, telling reporters talks were happening right now, live, at that very moment. Oil prices dropped, stocks moved, and then Tehran flatly denied it. Again. This isn't the first time this exact pattern has played out. And that pattern, claim, denial, is exactly why nobody trusts the timeline anymore. To understand how we got here, rewind 5 months. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a new wave of strikes on Iran, reigniting a war that had already scarred the region since the previous summer. Weeks of fighting followed. Missiles, drone shootdowns. A U.S. fighter pilot off the carrier, USS Abraham Lincoln, downed an Iranian drone that got too close to the strike group in the Arabian Sea. Then, in June, a fragile pause. An agreement known as the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding was signed, brokered with Pakistani and Qatari mediators sitting at the table. It bought a ceasefire. It also came with a promise that Iran would use its best efforts to keep the Strait of Hormuz open for commercial shipping. That promise didn't hold. By July, the memorandum was already collapsing. Iran struck commercial vessels moving through the strait, accusing Washington of violating the agreement first. Washington accused Tehran of holding the world's oil supply hostage. Both sides dug in, and the strait, the waterway that carries roughly 1/5 of the entire planet's oil and gas, has stayed effectively closed to normal commercial traffic ever since. Now here's the part that should worry you more than the headlines do. There's a third figure sitting at nearly every one of these negotiating tables, and it isn't a diplomat. His name is Admiral Brad Cooper, the head of U.S. Central Command. Earlier this year, when American and Iranian delegations met through Omani intermediaries in Muscat, Cooper showed up in full dress uniform. Not Witkoff, not Kushner. A 4-star admiral sitting in a room that was supposed to be about diplomacy. Nobody in that room needed it. Explained what his presence meant. The USS Abraham Lincoln and her strike group were parked off Iran's coast at that exact moment. The message was the message. Talk, or the ships stay close. That detail matters even more now, in August, because the shuttle diplomacy hasn't stopped. It's just gotten quieter and stranger. Araghchi says messages are being passed through intermediary countries. He's named Pakistan. He's hinted at Qatar. There are signs Oman is still the primary channel, still hosting separate closed-door sessions with each side, one after another, never in the same room at the same time. This is what indirect talks actually looks like on the ground. Not two delegations facing off across a table, couriers, sealed messages. A room in Muscat where an Omani official walks from one hallway to another, carrying language that both governments will later deny agreeing to. Steve Witkoff, the president's Middle East envoy, has been at the center of that shuttle before, and it hasn't always gone smoothly. A Gulf diplomat with direct knowledge of an earlier round accused Witkoff of publicly mischaracterizing what Iranian negotiators told him behind closed doors, specifically around claims about Iran's uranium stockpile. Iran's side pushed back hard, insisting the framing was false. That friction hasn't gone away. If anything, it's the reason Tehran keeps saying indirect, like it's a warning label. Let's talk about the hardware sitting behind all of this, because the diplomacy only makes sense once you see the fleet. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group has been the anchor of the U.S. military posture in the Arabian Sea through most of this year. Carrier Air Wing 9 flies off her deck. An Aegis-equipped destroyer screen rides alongside her, built specifically to shoot down exactly the kind of drone and missile fire Iran has used against shipping in the Strait. That's not a coincidence of timing. It's the backdrop every round of talks happens against. When Witkoff and Kushner flew out to visit the Lincoln in person earlier this year, standing next to Admiral Cooper on her flight deck, the message to Tehran wasn't subtle. Diplomacy and deterrence were traveling on the same plane. The Pentagon has since asked major U.S. defense contractors to speed up production and delivery of key weapon systems, a request that reads less like routine procurement and more like a hedge against this exact scenario dragging into the fall. Nobody wants to say publicly that Washington is restocking for round 3. But that's what accelerating weapons deliveries during an active ceasefire negotiation usually means. Now, the number that actually explains why this is so dangerous. Before the first wave of strikes back in mid-2025, international inspectors from the IAEA calculated that Iran had stockpiled 440.9 kilograms of uranium enriched up to 60% purity. Iran's total enriched uranium inventory across every purity level stood at roughly 9,975 kilograms. Here's why that number should make your stomach drop. The IAEA's own threshold for what's needed to theoretically build one atomic weapon is around 42 kilograms of 60% material, if enriched further to weapons grade. Iran's declared stockpile at that time was more than 10 times that amount. And the technical gap between 60% and 90%, the line that separates close from weapons grade, is small. Arms control analysts who studied the separative work embodied in Iran's centrifuge output concluded that roughly 99% of the physics work needed to get to weapons grade had already been done by the time Iran sat at 60%. The last stretch, they estimated, could take days to a few weeks with the centrifuges Iran had running. But here's the catch nobody wants to say out loud on camera. Since the June 2025 strikes hit Iran's facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, the IAEA has not been able to verify where that stockpile actually is. Inspectors haven't seen it since. Iran suspended cooperation. Nobody, not the UN, not Washington, not Tel Aviv, can currently confirm whether that uranium sits buried under rubble, was moved before the strikes, or is somewhere else entirely. That uncertainty is the single biggest reason Israeli hardliners don't want a slow diplomatic track. And it's the reason Washington's own negotiators keep circling back to the same demand: verified access before anything else moves forward. Back in March, Araghchi floated what sounded, briefly, like a breakthrough. Iran's secret offer delivered live on American television was this: Tehran would be willing to dilute, downblend, its highly enriched stockpile into lower, civilian-grade material in exchange for relief from crushing sanctions. It was, by his own description, a major concession. It also went nowhere. The war restarted within weeks. There's one more wrinkle in the uranium story that almost never makes it into a headline. IAEA reporting shows Iran's monthly production capacity for 60% material at the Fordo facility was, before the strikes, set to jump dramatically, from roughly 4.7 kilograms a month to as much as 37 kilograms a month, simply by changing how centrifuges were fed. Fordo itself is built deep into a mountainside specifically to survive exactly the kind of airstrikes that hit it in 2025. That combination, a hardened site, a fast production ramp, and a stockpile nobody can currently verify, is the single scenario every Israeli and American planner is trying to rule out before agreeing to anything permanent. It's also exactly why Tehran's demand for sanctions relief before inspections keeps colliding with Washington's demand for inspections before sanctions relief. Neither side will move first, and that standoff within the standoff is arguably more dangerous than the tanker traffic getting all the airtime. So where does that leave the actual choke point, the strait itself? Iran and Oman have been negotiating separately for weeks now over who actually controls shipping lanes through Hormuz. Araghchi has called that piece of the puzzle very close to done, a temporary arrangement lasting up to 3 months that would let Iran claim a formal administrative role over the waterway going forward. Here's the domino effect most coverage skips entirely. Even if Iran and Oman shake hands on that deal, it does not automatically reopen the strait to normal traffic. Araghchi has said so explicitly. A deal on paper and ships actually moving again are two very different things. And right now, ships are not moving the way they used to. Trade intelligence firm Kepler tracked a 33% drop in vessel traffic through Hormuz on a single recent Friday compared to the day before, with most ships that did move choosing a route that hugs the Iranian coastline instead of the open channel. That's not a market functioning normally. That's a market surviving on a knife's edge, one incident away from panic. Which brings us to the money, because this is where the war stops being abstract for anyone watching from outside the region. Brent crude, the global benchmark, closed a recent session at $83.55 a barrel. U.S. crude settled near $78.18. Both had actually fallen more than 7% over the prior week, as traders bet, maybe too early, that a Hormuz deal was close. Every rumor of a breakthrough sends prices down. Every denial, every drone strike, every burning refinery sends them right back up. That volatility is the real casualty of indirect diplomacy. A global economy flinching at every leak from Muscat. And the leaks keep coming, because the fighting hasn't actually stopped at the strait. Just weeks ago, Houthi forces in Yemen, widely understood to be backed by Tehran, claimed a drone strike on a Saudi Aramco refinery complex in Jazan. Firefighters put the blaze out. but satellite images of smoke rising over one of Saudi Arabia's key oil installations told their own story. This conflict has already spread beyond Iran's own coastline, pulling in Saudi Arabia, a country that isn't even a formal party to the war. That's signal number 2, and it's the one energy traders watch even more closely than the Muscat talks. A strike on Iranian assets is priced as regional risk. A strike that actually damages Saudi export infrastructure is priced as a supply shock, because Saudi Arabia, not Iran, is the swing producer the whole global market leans on when barrels get tight. Jazan was a warning shot that landed on the wrong side of the ledger for anyone hoping this stays contained. If Jazan had gone differently, if that refinery fire had spread, if Saudi output had been meaningfully disrupted, analysts warn oil could have spiked well past $100 a barrel inside days. Every major economy that imports Gulf crude would have felt it within a week. That is the domino nobody in Washington wants to say out loud on a Sunday news show. Think about who actually eats that domino effect if it spirals. Gulf Arabs, states like Qatar and the UAE have spent months privately pushing both Washington and Tehran to keep talking, precisely because they know a full regional war doesn't stay contained to Iran and Israel. Their own ports, their own tankers, their own airspace set inside blast radius of any serious escalation. That's part of why Doha and Islamabad keep offering their capitals as neutral ground. They have more to lose from silence than almost anyone at the table. Insurance markets are already pricing that risk in. War risk premiums for tankers transiting Hormuz have been reported climbing sharply every time fighting flares, adding real cost to every barrel that does move. A quiet tax on the global economy that shows up at the gas pump weeks later, long after the headlines about drone shootdowns have faded. Now, the internal friction, because this war has never had just two sides. Inside Iran, Araghchi's negotiating track is being run in the shadow of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the hardline military force that has, in past rounds of this conflict, threatened to seize U.S.-flagged vessels moving through the strait. The IRGC backed off that specific threat once before, only after American warships moved to respond. Every diplomat in this story is negotiating with one eye on whether Tehran's military wing will let any deal survive contact with reality. On the other side, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has gone strangely quiet on Iran specifically, even as he stays vocal on the parallel Gaza track. That silence is not comfort. It's political math. Netanyahu is facing a general election at the end of October, and he is under real pressure from Washington to accept a ceasefire sequencing in Gaza that his own base may not forgive. A prime minister who needs hardline votes in October does not have much political room to publicly bless a slow, sanctions relief-heavy deal with Tehran in August. Analysts across the region expect that pressure only to intensify as the vote gets closer, and Israeli hardliners have made clear they'd rather see renewed strikes than another interim memorandum that Iran can walk away from. There's a second layer to Netanyahu's silence worth sitting with. He's simultaneously being pushed by the White House to finalize a Hamas disarmament sequence in Gaza, a separate parallel negotiation that's already straining his coalition. Every concession he makes on one file gets read by his own hardliners as a signal about the other. A prime minister who bends on Gaza timing in August has less room to bend on Iran verification in September, and everyone at the table knows it. That's the quiet arithmetic running underneath every Hormuz headline. It's not just Washington and Tehran deciding whether to talk. It's Jerusalem deciding how much daylight it can afford to show between now and a ballot box in late October. And that calculation moves independently of anything Araghchi or Witkoff actually agree to in Muscat. Meanwhile, President Trump's own public posture has shifted, and that shift matters more than it sounds. In a recent interview, Trump signaled patience, a notable change in tone from a president who, just days earlier, had threatened what he called the biggest attack since World War II before pulling it back at the last minute. His new strategy, by his own description, is to let Iran's economy do the work that missiles haven't finished. And Iran's economy is genuinely buckling. The country's year-over-year inflation rate has been reported at 77% by its own central bank. That is not a number a government can quietly absorb forever. It's a pressure cooker with a lid that Tehran's negotiators know is rattling. But here's the second catch, and it's the one that should worry anyone betting on a quick resolution. Betting that economic pain forces Iran to fold assumes Iran's leadership responds to pressure the way a rational actor in a spreadsheet would. This is a government that has repeatedly chosen to strike shipping and burn a ceasefire to the ground rather than accept terms it viewed as humiliating. Economic collapse and diplomatic capitulation are not the same thing, and history in this specific conflict says they don't automatically follow one another. So where does that leave the next 3 days? On one path, Oman and Iran finalized their temporary shipping arrangement. Intermediaries in Doha and Islamabad keep shuttling quiet language back to Washington. And enough goodwill builds that direct talks, real ones, face to face, become possible again before the month is out. Oil drifts back down. Insurance rates on tanker traffic ease. The carriers stay parked, but the drone shoot-downs stop. Ship traffic through Hormuz climbs back toward normal, and the 33% drop we're seeing right now becomes a footnote instead of the start of a bigger squeeze. On the other path, the IRGC vetoes whatever Araghchi and the Omanis produce, a single incident in the Strait, a seized tanker, a downed drone, a refinery fire that doesn't get extinguished in time, reignites the shooting war, and Washington's patience runs out before Tehran's economy does. Trump has already said what happens next if that line gets crossed. He's called it the hit that's yet to come. Brent crude, sitting near $84 tonight, would not stay there for long. Watch 3 things over the next 72 hours if you want to know which path we're on before the headlines catch up. Watch whether Iran and Oman actually announce a signed shipping arrangement, or just another round of final stage statements with no signature attached. Watch whether the IRGC makes any move toward a U.S.-flagged vessel, the way it's threatened before. And watch Tehran's own state media. Because the moment language shifts from no possibility of resuming negotiations to anything softer, that's the tell that the intermediaries have actually landed something real. 2 intermediary countries are still working the phones tonight. 3 governments are watching an election calendar. A stockpile of enriched uranium sits somewhere nobody outside Tehran can verify. And a strait carrying 1/5 of the world's oil is still, as of tonight, not fully open. Deal or bombs. Those are the only 2 doors left on this timeline. And every side involved knows it. The next 72 hours decide which one they walk through.